On Thanksgiving Day, my daughter-in-law said, "Dinner's at my mom's. You stay home." I didn't argue, I just booked a trip. When I posted the photos and she saw who was sitting next to me, my phone exploded with messages. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I stood in my kitchen, staring at the turkey I'd bought 3 days ago, still frozen solid in my refrigerator. 22 pounds of butterball that would never see the inside of my oven. My hands trembled as I held the phone, Kala's words echoing in my mind like a death sentence. "Dinner's at my mom's house this year, Joelle. We won't have room for everyone. Won't have room." As if I were some distant relative they barely knew, not the grandmother of her 2 children. Not the woman who had raised the son she claimed to love so deeply before cancer took him from us 18 months ago. I walked to the living room and sank into David's old recliner, the one I couldn't bring myself to donate, even though the leather had worn thin on the armrests where his hands used to rest. The silence in the house felt different now, heavier somehow. For 67 years, I'd never spent Thanksgiving alone. Even during the lean years when money was tight and David was working double shifts at the factory, we always found a way to gather around our small kitchen table. My phone buzzed with a text message. A photo from Kala showed up on my screen, her mother's dining room table, elegantly set with what looked like service for 12 people. The caption read, "Getting ready for our family feast. So grateful for everyone who could make it." Everyone who could make it. The passive-aggressive undertone wasn't lost on me. I scrolled through her social media, something I rarely did but found myself doing more often since David's death. There were photos from last weekend's soccer game where my grandson Tommy scored his first goal of the season. I'd asked Kala 3 times when the games were, and each time she gave me a vague, "I'll let you know," that never materialized into an actual invitation. There was Emma's school play from 2 weeks ago, where my granddaughter played a dancing sunflower. I'd only learned about it when I ran into Kala's neighbor at the grocery store. The pattern had been building for months, but I'd been too hopeful, too trusting to see it clearly. Each exclusion came with a reasonable explanation. Each missed moment was justified by scheduling conflicts or last-minute changes. But looking at that perfectly set table, I finally understood the truth. Kala didn't want me around. I thought back to the days immediately after David's funeral, how she'd seemed genuinely grateful for my help with the children while she dealt with her grief. She'd called me almost daily, asking me to pick up Emma from school or watch Tommy during his afternoon nap. I'd been so touched that she was leaning on me, that she saw me as someone she could count on during the hardest time in both our lives. But gradually, those calls became less frequent. The invitations to family dinners dwindled. The casual drop-ins where the kids would run to hug Grandma Joe became scheduled visits that somehow kept getting postponed. I'd tried to address it directly once, about 2 months ago. I'd asked Kala if everything was okay between us, if I'd done something to upset her. She'd looked at me with those wide, innocent brown eyes and insisted I was imagining things. "You're family, Joelle. You'll always be family. I've just been so overwhelmed with everything. Overwhelmed." Yet she seemed to have plenty of time for her book club, her yoga classes, and her girls' nights out that she documented extensively on Facebook. The worst part wasn't even the exclusion itself. It was the way she made me feel like I was being unreasonable for wanting to be included. Like I was some needy old woman who couldn't take a hint. When I'd mentioned wanting to take the kids to the zoo last month, she'd sighed and said, "Joelle, I really need to establish some stability in their routine right now." When I offered to help with Tommy's birthday party planning, she'd smiled that tight smile and said, "I've got it all handled, but thanks. I've got it all handled." The polite dismissal that cut deeper each time I heard it. My daughter Linda had called from Oregon earlier in the week, asking about my Thanksgiving plans. When I told her I'd be spending it with Kala and the kids, I could hear the concern in her voice. "Mom, are you sure? You know you're always welcome to fly out here." Linda had never liked Kala, even before David died. She'd always said there was something calculated about my daughter-in-law, something that felt performative rather than genuine. I'd defended Kala then, believing that Linda was just protective of her brother and maybe a little jealous of how quickly David had fallen for his college girlfriend. Now I wondered if Linda had seen something I'd been too blind to recognize. I looked around my living room, at the photos covering every surface. David and me on our wedding day 43 years ago. David holding Tommy as a newborn, his face glowing with pride. Emma taking her first steps in this very room, her arms stretched toward David's encouraging smile. The children had been my connection to my son after he was gone, the living proof that his love would continue in the world. But what happened when that connection was deliberately severed? What happened when the gatekeeper decided you weren't worth keeping around? The turkey in my refrigerator suddenly felt like a symbol of my own foolishness. I'd bought it assuming I'd be cooking for my family, the way I had for decades. I'd even picked up Emma's favorite cranberry sauce and the specific brand of stuffing that Tommy liked. All of it sitting in my kitchen like evidence of a celebration that was never going to happen. I grabbed my purse from the hallway table, my mind suddenly clear for the first time in months. If Calla wanted to exclude me from her version of family, fine. But I wasn't going to sit in this empty house feeling sorry for myself while she played happy families with everyone except me. I had 24 hours until Thanksgiving. 24 hours to decide who I really was, the discarded grandmother accepting scraps of affection, or the woman who'd raised 3 children, buried a husband, and survived more disappointments than Calla could imagine. My phone rang as I reached for my car keys. Calla's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, my heart leaped. Maybe she'd reconsidered. Maybe she'd realized how cruel her exclusion had been. Hello? Hi, Joelle. I just wanted to make sure you were okay with tomorrow's arrangement. I know it's different from what you're used to. Different from what I'm used to. Like spending Thanksgiving with my family was some quaint tradition I needed to get over. I'm perfectly fine, Calla. Great! I thought maybe you could use the quiet time anyway. I know the holidays have been hard since David. She trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. That I was too fragile, too broken by grief to be good company. That my sadness would somehow taint their perfect family gathering. You're right, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. I think I'll use the time differently this year. There was a pause. I could almost hear her trying to figure out if there was any passive-aggressive undertone to my response. Wonderful. I'll call you Friday and maybe we can arrange something for the weekend. Maybe. Another maybe to add to the collection of empty promises. After I hung up, I sat in my car for several minutes, feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Not anger, exactly, and not sadness. Something sharper and more energizing. For the first time since David's death, I felt like I had a choice to make. And I was going to make one that surprised everyone, including myself. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a number I hadn't dialed in over 2 years. My finger hovered over the call button for a long moment before I pressed it. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered, warm and slightly questioning. Marcus, it's Joelle. Joelle? Marcus's voice carried the same gentle surprise I remembered from decades ago, though it was deeper now, roughened by time and experience. My God, it really is you. I closed my eyes, transported back to a different version of myself. A 22-year-old woman who thought she had all the time in the world to make the right choices. Hello, Marcus. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. Never a bad time for you. The words came so easily, as if 45 years hadn't passed between them. How are you? I heard about David. I'm so sorry. Of course he'd heard. In a town the size of Cedar Rapids, news traveled fast, especially when it involved people who'd once been as talked about as we were. Marcus and I had been the couple everyone expected to marry right out of college. High school sweethearts who seemed destined for a fairy tale ending until life got complicated in ways neither of us had anticipated. Thank you. It's been difficult. I paused, suddenly unsure why I'd called. What did I expect to accomplish with this conversation? Marcus, I know this is going to sound strange, but what are you doing tomorrow? There was a brief silence, and I could imagine him processing the question, trying to understand what I was really asking. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving. Yes, it is. Well, since Margaret passed last year, I've been spending it alone. My daughter and her family are in California, and I haven't felt much like celebrating. He cleared his throat. Why do you ask? Margaret. I'd heard about her death through mutual acquaintances, though I'd never met David's wife. She'd been a lovely woman by all accounts, a teacher who'd devoted her life to helping children read. They'd been married for 38 years, and by everything I'd heard, it had been a happy marriage. The kind of partnership I'd always hoped Marcus would find after everything that happened between us. I find myself in a similar situation, I said carefully. My daughter-in-law has made other arrangements, and I'm looking at spending the day alone as well. That doesn't sound like the Joelle I remember. You always had family around, people who needed taking care of. He was right. Even after David and I married, even after Linda and Michael were born, I'd always been the one coordinating holiday gatherings, making sure everyone was included. It was who I was, or who I thought I was, until Calla made it clear that my services were no longer required. Things change, I said simply. They do indeed. Another pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had taken on a different quality, more tentative but also warmer. Joelle, would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow? Nothing fancy, just two old friends who don't want to spend Thanksgiving alone. The question should have surprised me, but somehow it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I'd like that very much. Do you still like to travel? I was thinking we could drive up to that little inn in Galena we used to talk about visiting. They do a traditional Thanksgiving dinner and we could catch up. The inn at Galena. We'd planned to go there for our honeymoon, back when we thought we were going to get married. Back before everything fell apart in ways that seemed insurmountable at 22, but might look different from the perspective of 67. That sounds perfect, I heard myself saying. What time should I be ready? How about I pick you up at 10? It's about a 2-hour drive, and they serve dinner at 2. After we hung up, I sat in my car feeling like I'd just stepped off the edge of a cliff and discovered I could fly. The spontaneity of it, the sheer impulsiveness, felt completely unlike the careful, measured decisions I'd been making for the past 18 months. Since David's death, every choice had been weighed against grief and obligation and what other people expected of me. This was different. This was just for me. I drove to the mall, something I rarely did anymore since most of my shopping moved online. But I needed clothes for tomorrow, something that wasn't widow black or grandmother practical. The saleswoman at Nordstrom was probably my daughter's age, with perfectly highlighted hair and a genuine smile that didn't feel condescending when I explained I was looking for something appropriate for dinner at a nice inn. Are you celebrating something special? She asked as she pulled several options from the rack. In a way, yes. I fingered the fabric of a burgundy wrap dress that looked elegant without trying too hard. I'm having dinner with an old friend. How wonderful! Old friends are the best. They know all your stories already. All your stories. If only it were that simple. The dress fit perfectly, and when I looked in the fitting room mirror, I saw something I hadn't noticed in months. I looked like myself again, not just the grieving widow or the dismissed grandmother, but Joelle, a woman with her own life and her own choices to make. I bought the dress, along with a new pair of shoes and a small overnight bag that surprised me with its implications. Was I planning to stay the night? The inn had rooms available, Marcus had mentioned during our brief conversation about logistics. Separate rooms, of course, but still. The thought made me feel both terrified and exhilarated. At home, I found myself moving with purpose I hadn't felt in months. I made a hair appointment for first thing in the morning, something I never would have done on such short notice before, but the receptionist was accommodating when I explained it was for a special occasion. I laid the new dress out on my bed, along with the pearl necklace David had given me for our 20th anniversary. He'd always said it brought out the color in my eyes, and looking at it now, I realized he was right. When had I stopped wearing things that made me feel beautiful? My phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "How's your Thanksgiving prep going, Mom? Are you making your famous sweet potato casserole for Kala's family? I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Change of plans. I'm having dinner with an old friend instead. Her response came immediately. Really? Who? That's wonderful. I hesitated before typing. Marcus Wellington. Do you remember me mentioning him? The phone rang before I could set it down. Mom? Marcus Wellington? Your old boyfriend, Marcus Wellington? Linda's voice was sharp with surprise and something else I couldn't quite identify. We're just having dinner, Linda. Two old friends catching up. Mom, he's not just any old friend. Didn't you tell me once that he was the one who got away? That if things had been different? She trailed off, but I knew what she was remembering. A conversation we'd had years ago, probably after a few glasses of wine at Christmas, where I'd mentioned the path not taken. The choices that seemed impossible at the time, but might have led to a completely different life. That was a very long time ago, I said carefully. But still. Mom, are you sure you're ready for this? I mean, Dad's only been gone 18 months. Only been gone. As if there was some prescribed timeline for when it became acceptable to have dinner with someone who wasn't your deceased husband. As if my grief came with an expiration date that everyone else got to determine. I'm having Thanksgiving dinner, Linda. I'm not running away to Vegas. She laughed, but it sounded strained. I know, I'm sorry. I just worry about you, and after what you told me about how Kala's been acting. This has nothing to do with Kala, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. If Kala had invited me to her mother's house, if she'd made me feel welcome in my grandchildren's lives, would I have called Marcus? Or would I have continued playing the role of the grateful, undemanding grandmother, accepting whatever scraps of affection she was willing to offer? I love you, Mom. Have a wonderful time. After I hung up, I walked through my house, seeing it differently. The photos of David and me, the accumulated memories of 43 years of marriage, the life we'd built together. None of it felt threatened by tomorrow's dinner. If anything, it felt like David would have approved. He'd never been a jealous man, and he'd always encouraged me to maintain my friendships, even the complicated ones from before we met. I picked up a photo of him from our last anniversary, taken at the restaurant where he'd proposed all those years ago. He was smiling at something I'd said, his eyes crinkled with laughter and genuine affection. A good man who'd loved me completely and without reservation. What do you think, sweetheart? I asked his picture. Am I doing the right thing? The silence that followed felt peaceful rather than empty. For the first time since his death, I wasn't asking for permission to live my life. I was simply living it. I was in the middle of packing my overnight bag when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Kala standing on my front porch, shifting her weight from foot to foot in the way she did when she was nervous or upset about something. I opened the door, and her eyes immediately went to the overnight bag in my hand. Going somewhere? She asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp with curiosity. Actually, yes. I have plans for tomorrow. Her eyebrows shot up. Plans? What kind of plans? For a moment, I considered telling her the truth. But something in her expression, a kind of proprietary concern that suggested she thought she had the right to approve my social calendar, made me pause. I'm having dinner with a friend. Oh, she looked genuinely surprised, as if the idea that I might have friends she didn't know about had never occurred to her. Well, that's nice. I just stopped by to drop off some leftovers from tonight's prep. Mom made way too much stuffing. She held out a small container, the kind gesture that might have meant something if it hadn't come with the underlying message that these were scraps, extras that nobody else wanted. That's thoughtful, thank you. So, this friend, she pressed, not taking the hint that I wasn't interested in sharing details. Anyone I know? I met her eyes steadily. No, I don't think you do. Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of something that might have been alarm or might have been irritation. As if my having a life outside of her control was somehow problematic. Well, I hope you have a nice time. After she left, I realized I was smiling. For the first time in months, I had a secret. Something that belonged entirely to me, that Kala couldn't organize or approve or dismiss. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be the excluded grandmother sitting alone in my house. I'd be a woman having dinner with someone who'd once known her better than anyone. The question was, who would I discover I'd become in all the years between then and now? The drive to Galena passed in comfortable conversation, punctuated by moments of profound silence. Marcus looked distinguished behind the wheel of his silver Lexus. His hair completely white now, but still thick, his profile showing the same strong jawline I remembered from our college days. He'd aged well, the way men do when they take care of themselves and haven't been worn down by disappointment. We talked about safe subjects at first. The changing landscape along Highway 20, his retirement from the insurance business 3 years ago, my volunteer work at the library before David's illness made it impossible to maintain regular commitments. But underneath the polite catching up, I could feel the weight of everything we weren't saying, all the history that stretched between us like a bridge neither of us was quite ready to cross. The inn at Galena sat on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River, its Victorian architecture and wraparound porches exactly as I'd imagined all those years ago. Marcus had reserved a table by the windows, and as we settled in with our wine, a bottle of Pinot Noir that he'd ordered without consulting me, somehow remembering it was my favorite, I felt a strange sense of completion, as if a circle was finally closing. "You look beautiful, Joelle," he said simply, raising his glass. I should have said that earlier, but I was nervous. Nervous? I laughed, touched by his honesty. We're both too old for nerves. Are we? He smiled, and I caught a glimpse of the young man who'd once made my heart race. I haven't been on a dinner date in over 2 years. I'm not sure the rules are the same at our age. A dinner date. The phrase sent a flutter through my chest that I hadn't expected. I'm not sure there are any rules at our age. We ordered the traditional Thanksgiving meal, turkey with all the trimmings, the kind of comfort food that felt appropriate for the day and the conversation we were dancing around. As we waited for our food, Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me pictures of his daughter and grandchildren in California. Sarah's youngest just turned 16, he said, swiping to a photo of a girl who looked strikingly like Marcus had at that age. She wants to be a veterinarian, very determined, just like her grandmother was. Margaret was determined? Actually, I meant like you. He set his phone down and looked at me directly. Sarah has your eyes, Joelle, your determination, your way of tilting her head when she's thinking through a problem. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the photo, then at Marcus, trying to process what he was telling me without actually saying it. Marcus, I whispered, my voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. I know, I should have told you differently, should have prepared you. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his, but I wasn't sure how to bring it up after all this time. My mind raced backward, calculating dates and possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider. 46 years ago, when Marcus and I had broken up, when I'd discovered I was pregnant and panicked, when David had stepped in to marry me and give the baby his name without ever asking questions about timing or paternity. David knew? My voice cracked on my dead husband's name. I don't think so, not for certain. But he loved you, and he loved Michael as his own son. That's what mattered to him. Michael, my firstborn, who died of cancer 18 months ago. David and Michael had been so close, had shared the same gentle humor and practical approach to life. I'd never seen Marcus in my son, had never allowed myself to look for similarities that might complicate the life we'd all built together. How long have you known? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the river. I suspected when Michael was born. He was premature, but not as premature as he should have been if the timing was what you and David claimed. But you were married, you were happy, and I was young and scared and dealing with my own family's expectations about who I should marry. The waitress brought our food, and we sat in silence as she fussed with our plates and refilled our water glasses. The normalcy of the service felt surreal against the magnitude of what we were discussing. When did you know for sure? I asked after she left. 10 years ago, Michael needed surgery, remember? Needed some kind of complications from an old football injury. He needed blood, and David wasn't a match. They tested family members, and Linda wasn't compatible either. That's when the doctors mentioned that sometimes blood types can be surprising, that maybe they should look at a broader genetic panel. I remembered that surgery. Michael had been in his early 40s, and what should have been routine arthroscopic work had turned complicated when they discovered unexpected scar tissue. David had been frustrated that he couldn't help, had felt helpless in the way that parents do when their children are hurting and there's nothing they can do. Michael called me, Marcus continued. Did you know that? He said he'd been thinking about family medical history, about making sure his kids knew everything they might need to know. He asked if I'd be willing to be tested, just to rule out some hereditary conditions. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. And? Perfect match. Not just compatible, perfect. The kind of match you only get between parent and child. I set down my fork, no longer able to pretend I was eating. Did you tell him? No, but I think he figured it out. He was a smart man, Joelle. He started asking questions about our college years, about why we broke up. He wanted to know if there were things he should understand about his medical history. What did you say? I told him that the past was complicated, but that David was his father in every way that mattered. That seemed to satisfy him, at least outwardly. But after that, he started calling me occasionally. Not often, maybe every few months. Just to check in, he said, to maintain family connections. Family connections. My son had known, or at least suspected, and he'd reached out to his biological father without ever telling me. The thought should have hurt, but instead, it felt like something clicking into place. Michael had always been curious about genetics and family traits, had always been the one asking questions about relatives he'd never met, and family stories that didn't quite add up. He never said anything to you? Marcus asked gently. I shook my head. Not directly. But in the last few months before he got sick, he started talking more about the importance of family, about making sure people know they're loved before it's too late. I thought he was just being sentimental because of David's age. Maybe he was. Or maybe he was trying to tell you something without betraying David's memory. I looked out at the river, watching a barge make its slow way downstream, and tried to reconcile this new version of my history with everything I'd believed for 46 years. David, who'd married me knowing I was pregnant with another man's child and had never once made me feel ashamed or grateful or like I owed him anything. Marcus, who'd let us go to protect the life we'd built, even though it meant giving up his son. Michael, who'd figured out the truth and had found a way to honor both of his fathers without causing pain to anyone. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Marcus was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Because when I heard about Michael's death, I realized I'd lost my son twice. Once when I walked away 46 years ago, and again when cancer took him before I could figure out how to be part of his life properly. I don't want to make the same mistake with you. Marcus, I'm not asking you to choose me over David's memory. I'm not asking you to rewrite history or pretend the life you built wasn't real and good. But I'm asking if maybe, after all this time, we could find a way to be in each other's lives again. I thought about Kala's dismissal, about spending Thanksgiving alone, about the slow erosion of my place in my grandchildren's lives. Then I thought about the ease I'd felt during our drive, the sense of being seen and valued by someone who knew me before I became defined by my roles as wife, mother, and grandmother. I don't know how to do this, I admitted. Neither do I. But maybe we could figure it out together. The waitress brought our coffee and slices of pumpkin pie, and as we shared dessert, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Marcus told me about his travels since retirement, about the book he was writing about the insurance industry's evolution. I found myself talking about dreams I'd put aside, about wanting to learn photography and maybe take art classes. It felt like coming alive again, like rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried under years of taking care of everyone else. When Marcus suggested we stay overnight, separate rooms, he emphasized quickly, I found myself saying yes before I'd fully considered the implications. We walked through Galena's historic downtown as the sun set, looking in shop windows and talking about everything and nothing. He bought me a small silver bracelet from an antique store, something delicate and pretty that had caught my eye. "For a new beginning," he said as he fastened it around my wrist. Standing on the sidewalk outside the inn as evening fell, I felt like a different person than the woman who'd been excluded from Thanksgiving dinner just that morning. Marcus was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen in decades. Not the careful politeness of old friends catching up, but something deeper and more complicated. "Joelle," he said softly, reaching up to touch my cheek. "I know this is all very sudden, but I need you to know something." "What?" "I never stopped loving you. Not completely. Part of me has been waiting 46 years for a second chance." Before I could respond, before I could think about all the reasons why this was complicated and potentially devastating to the careful equilibrium of my life, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. Kala's name appeared on the screen. I looked at Marcus, at his hopeful expression and the silver bracelet glinting on my wrist, then at my phone still buzzing insistently. For once in my life, I sent the call to voicemail. "What were you saying?" I asked, stepping closer to him. But even as he smiled and took my hand, even as I felt the flutter of possibility and second chances, I could see Kala's name lighting up my phone screen again. Something told me she hadn't given up trying to reach me. And something else told me that when she finally did, everything was about to become much more complicated than a simple Thanksgiving dinner with an old friend. I didn't check my messages until the next morning. Marcus and I had spent the evening walking along the river and talking in the inn's lobby until nearly midnight, sharing stories and memories that felt both nostalgic and surprisingly current. When I finally returned to my room, I was emotionally exhausted in the best possible way, and I'd turned my phone off completely. The morning brought 17 missed calls and 23 text messages. I sat on the edge of my hotel bed, still in my robe, scrolling through the increasingly frantic communications from Kala. The first few were innocuous enough, asking where I was, saying she hoped I was having a nice time with my friend. But as the evening progressed, the tone shifted dramatically. Message at 7:15. "Joelle, please call me back. I'm getting worried." Message at 8:30. "Your neighbor said she saw you leave with a man yesterday. Is everything okay?" Message at 9:45. "I found some photos on Facebook. We need to talk." My heart stopped. Photos on Facebook. I grabbed my laptop and logged into my account, scrolling through my feed until I found what Kala must have seen. The inn's official page had posted pictures from their Thanksgiving dinner service, featuring happy couples and families enjoying their holiday meal. There in the background of one photo were Marcus and I at our window table, laughing about something over our wine. We looked comfortable together, familiar in a way that suggested more than a casual dinner between old acquaintances. The lighting was flattering, and Marcus had his hand over mine on the table in a gesture that could only be interpreted as intimate. I switched to Marcus's Facebook profile, something I hadn't looked at in years. His most recent post was from yesterday evening, a photo he'd taken of the sunset over the Mississippi River with the caption, "Perfect ending to a perfect day with someone special." The comments were already accumulating from his friends and family, many asking who the special someone was. But it was his profile information that made my blood run cold. Marcus Wellington, retired from Wellington Insurance Group, founder and former CEO of the company that had grown into one of the region's largest independent agencies. Wellington Insurance Group, the same company that handled the life insurance policy Michael had left behind. The same company that Kala dealt with regularly as the beneficiary of that policy. My phone rang in my hand, and this time I answered it. "Joelle." Kala's voice was tight, controlled in a way that suggested she was barely containing her anger. "Where are you?" "I'm in Galena, having breakfast." With Marcus Wellington. It wasn't a question, and I could hear the accusation underneath it. "Yes, with Marcus. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The question caught me off guard. What I've done? I had dinner with an old friend. An old friend? Kala's voice pitched higher. "Joelle, Marcus Wellington is the CEO of the company that holds Michael's life insurance policy. The policy that I've been working with for the past year and a half. The policy that's been paying Tommy's private school tuition and Emma's dance lessons and keeping our family afloat while I figure out how to rebuild our lives. I felt the blood drain from my face. In all our conversation yesterday, Marcus had never mentioned his connection to Michael's policy, had never indicated that he knew about Calla or had any involvement in my family's financial affairs. "I don't understand what you're suggesting," I said carefully. "I'm suggesting that it looks like you're sleeping with the man who controls our family's financial future. Do you understand how that appears? Do you understand what kind of position that puts me in? Calla, I'm not sleeping with anyone. And even if I were, it wouldn't be any of your business. It becomes my business when it affects my children's security." Her composure cracked completely. "Do you think this is some kind of game? Do you think you can just run off with random men and not consider the consequences for the rest of us?" Random men. The dismissiveness in her tone triggered something protective and fierce in me. Marcus is not a random man. We have a long history together. How long? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't prepared to explore over the phone. It's complicated. Uncomplicate it for me. I looked across the breakfast room where Marcus was reading the newspaper and drinking his coffee, occasionally glancing up to smile at me. He looked peaceful, content, completely unaware that our reunion was causing a crisis 2 hours away. "We dated in college, before I married David." And? And what? And what else? There has to be more to this story, Joelle. People don't just randomly reconnect with college boyfriends and run off to romantic inns unless there's something else going on. Her intuition was sharper than I'd given her credit for, but I wasn't about to reveal Michael's true parentage to her over the phone while she was already in crisis mode. Sometimes people do reconnect, especially after losing their spouses. "So this is what this is about? You're having some kind of midlife crisis because David is gone?" The casual cruelty of reducing my reconnection with Marcus to a psychological breakdown made me angry in a way I hadn't expected. "David has been gone for 18 months, Calla. I'm allowed to have relationships." "Not with the man who controls our insurance money, you're not." "Our insurance money?" I repeated slowly. "Since when is Michael's life insurance policy our money?" There was a pause that stretched too long, and when Calla spoke again, her voice had changed completely. The panic was still there, but underneath it was something harder, more calculating. "Since I became a single mother with 2 children and no career, because I spent 15 years supporting Michael's ambitions instead of building my own. Since I became the person responsible for keeping this family together after your son died." Your son, not her husband, not the father of her children. Your son, as if Michael's death was somehow my personal tragedy, rather than a loss that had devastated all of us. Calla, are you suggesting that I can't have a personal life because it might somehow interfere with the insurance payments you receive? I'm suggesting that you're being incredibly selfish and short-sighted, that you're jeopardizing our financial security for some romantic fantasy with a man who could destroy us with one phone call. The accusation was so outrageous that I almost laughed. Marcus doesn't make individual decisions about insurance claims. He's retired from day-to-day operations, and even if he weren't, insurance companies don't cancel legitimate policies because their executives have personal relationships. You don't know that. Actually, I do know that. Because unlike you, I don't assume that everything revolves around manipulation and personal favors. The insult hit home, and Calla's response was immediate and vicious. "Everything revolves around money, Joelle. And if you can't see that, then you're more naive than I thought. Is that really what you think of me? I think you're a lonely old woman who's so desperate for male attention that you're willing to risk our entire family's future for one night with someone who used to matter to you." The words were designed to hurt, and they succeeded. But they also revealed something about Calla that I'd been trying not to see for months. This wasn't about the insurance money or Marcus's potential influence. This was about control, about keeping me isolated and dependent and grateful for whatever scraps of family connection she was willing to provide. "I'm hanging up now," I said quietly. "Joelle, don't you dare." I ended the call and turned off my phone. Marcus looked up from his newspaper, concern creasing his features. "Everything okay?" I joined him at the table, my hands shaking slightly as I reached for my coffee. "My daughter-in-law just informed me that you're apparently holding my family hostage with your vast insurance empire." He set down his paper, his expression shifting from concern to something much more serious. "She knows who I am. She figured it out from the photos. Marcus, why didn't you tell me you handled Michael's policy?" "Because I don't handle it. Haven't for over 2 years." He reached across the table and took my hand. "Joelle, I need you to understand something. I stepped away from any involvement in your family's accounts the day I learned Michael was my biological son. It would have been a conflict of interest, and it wouldn't have been fair to any of you, but Kala doesn't know that. Kala doesn't know a lot of things, apparently." His voice carried an edge I hadn't heard before, including the fact that she's been lying to you about the insurance payments. I stared at him. "What do you mean?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to tell me. "The policy Michael left was substantial, $750,000. But it wasn't structured the way Kala has been telling people it was. $750,000. The number was staggering, far more than I'd ever imagined. Michael had always been responsible about insurance, but this suggested a level of financial planning I hadn't known he was capable of. How was it structured? 50% to Kala as the primary beneficiary, 25% to each of the children, held in trust until they turned 25. And there was a provision for you as well, $25,000 that was supposed to be paid out immediately upon his death. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I never received $25,000. I know, because Kala never submitted the paperwork claiming it. As far as the insurance company knows, you either don't want the money or don't know about it. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I couldn't immediately process it. She's been telling me that Michael barely left anything, that she's struggling to make ends meet. She received $375,000 18 months ago. The children's portions are earning interest in trust accounts that she has no access to, which means she can't touch another $375,000 until they come of age. So she has no ongoing financial pressure. None whatsoever. She could live comfortably for years on what she's already received, especially if she made reasonable investments. I thought about all the times she'd made comments about struggling to pay for the children's activities, about how expensive everything was as a single mother, about needing to be careful with money. I thought about the guilt I'd felt for not contributing more to the children's expenses, for not being able to help in ways that a grandmother should. She's been manipulating me. It appears that way, yes. But why? If she doesn't need money, why work so hard to keep me at arm's length? Why exclude me from the children's lives? Marcus squeezed my hand. "I think you know why, Joelle." I did know, though I'd been trying not to see it. Kala didn't want me around because grandmothers asked questions and paid attention and might notice when things didn't add up. She didn't want me forming independent relationships with Tommy and Emma because children who loved their grandmother might mention things that contradicted the narrative she was building. She wanted to be the sole authority on Michael's memory and the children's future, with no interference from the woman who'd raised the man she claimed to have loved. My phone, still turned off, sat on the table like a small bomb. When I turned it back on, there would be more messages, more accusations, more attempts to make me feel guilty for choosing my own happiness over her version of family loyalty. But for the first time in months, I didn't care what those messages said. "Marcus," I said slowly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course." "Yesterday, when you suggested this dinner, when you told me about Michael, was any of that motivated by what you know about Kala? About how she's been treating me?" He considered the question seriously before answering. "Partly, yes. I've been watching from a distance and I've seen how she's isolated you. But mostly, it was motivated by the fact that I've missed you every day for 46 years, and I finally had a reason to call. I believed him, which surprised me. After months of second-guessing every interaction and every motive, his honesty felt like a gift." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we finish our coffee. and then we drive back to reality and figure out how to navigate whatever storm is waiting for us. He was right about the storm. When I turned my phone back on, there were 37 new messages and 14 missed calls, not just from Kala, but from Linda, from neighbors, and from numbers I didn't recognize. The photo from the inn's Facebook page had been shared dozens of times, and apparently, the story of the grieving grandmother running off with her former lover was spreading through Cedar Rapids like wildfire. But as I read through the increasingly dramatic messages, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't care. Let them talk. Let Kala spin whatever narrative she wanted about my behavior and my motivations. Let the neighbors whisper about the timing and the appropriateness of my relationship with Marcus. For the first time in 18 months, I was exactly where I wanted to be, with someone who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. And if that threatened Kala's carefully constructed version of our family dynamics, then maybe it was time for those dynamics to change. The drive back to Cedar Rapids felt like traveling toward a battlefield. Marcus and I had decided he would drop me at home so I could face whatever was waiting there, and we would talk later once the immediate crisis had been dealt with. But as we pulled into my driveway, I could see Kala's black SUV parked aggressively close to my front door, and I knew there would be no graceful transition back to normal life. "Are you sure you don't want me to stay?" Marcus asked, eyeing the vehicle with obvious concern. "I need to handle this myself," I said, though my stomach was churning with anxiety. "But thank you. For everything." He squeezed my hand before I got out of the car. "Call me later. No matter how late, no matter what happens." Kala was sitting on my front porch steps, her arms wrapped around her knees in a posture that might have looked vulnerable if I hadn't known her better. She stood as I approached, her face a mask of controlled fury mixed with what appeared to be genuine distress. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "I assumed that's why you're here." I unlocked my front door, acutely aware that she was following me inside like she had every right to be there. "Would you like some coffee?" "I don't want coffee, Joelle. I want to understand what the hell you think you're doing." I set my overnight bag down in the hallway and turned to face her. In my own home, surrounded by my own belongings and memories, I felt more grounded than I had during our phone conversation. "I'm living my life, something I should have started doing months ago." "Living your life?" Kala's voice cracked with incredulity. "Is that what you call running off with Michael's insurance agent behind my back?" "Marcus is not Michael's insurance agent, and I didn't go behind anyone's back. I don't need your permission to have dinner with a friend." "A friend?" She pulled out her phone and showed me the screen. The photo from the inn's Facebook page was displayed, zoomed in to show Marcus and me at our table. "This doesn't look like dinner with a friend, Joelle. This looks like you're having an affair with someone who could destroy our family's financial security on a whim." The word affair hung in the air between us, loaded with judgment and implications. I realized that in Kala's mind, I was still supposed to be the grieving widow, forever faithful to David's memory, available to help with her problems, but never entitled to my own happiness. First of all, Marcus has no involvement in your insurance matters. Second, even if he did, that wouldn't give you the right to control my personal relationships. It gives me the right to protect my children. From what? From their grandmother having a life? Kala began pacing around my living room, her agitation growing more pronounced. From the scandal, from the gossip. Do you know what people are saying? That you've lost your mind with grief, that you're making a fool of yourself chasing after some old boyfriend like a teenager. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Is that what you think? That I'm making a fool of myself? I think you're not thinking clearly. I think you're so desperate to feel young again that you're willing to jeopardize everything Michael worked for, everything he left behind for his children. What exactly do you think I'm jeopardizing? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She stopped pacing and stared at me, as if trying to determine whether I was being deliberately obtuse or genuinely didn't understand the threat she perceived. "The insurance money," she said finally, her voice dropping to something close to a whisper. "If Marcus decides he doesn't like our family arrangement, if he thinks you're being taken advantage of, or if you two have some kind of falling out, The insurance money that Michael left for you and the children is not subject to Marcus's personal feelings. That's not how insurance works. You don't know that for certain. Actually, I do know it for certain, because Marcus told me exactly how Michael's policy was structured. Calla went very still. What do you mean? I sat down on my sofa, suddenly feeling very tired. I know about the $750,000, Calla. I know about the children's trust funds, and I know about the $25,000 that was supposed to come to me. The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. She sank into David's old recliner, her hands gripping the armrests. He told you, she whispered. He told me you never filed the paperwork to claim my portion. He told me you've been sitting on nearly $400,000 while telling me you're struggling financially. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. Calla was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the carpet. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with tears, but there was something calculating underneath them that made me wary of feeling too much sympathy. I was protecting you, she said softly. Protecting me from $25,000? Protecting you from feeling obligated. From feeling like you needed to help us when you should be enjoying your retirement. Her voice grew stronger, more confident as she built her narrative. I knew if you had that money, you'd try to spend it on Tommy and Emma, on things they needed. I wanted you to keep it for yourself, for traveling or whatever would make you happy. It was a beautiful story, selfless and considerate. It was also complete nonsense. If that were true, you could have simply told me about it and asked me to save it for myself. You didn't need to hide its existence entirely. I was going to tell you eventually, when the time was right. When would the time have been right, Calla? After you'd successfully pushed me out of the children's lives? After I stopped asking uncomfortable questions about why a widow with nearly $400,000 needed to struggle with basic expenses? The mask slipped then, just for a moment, and I saw something raw and desperate in her expression. You have no idea what it's been like, she said, her voice hardening. Being a single mother, having everyone judge every decision I make, having everyone think they know better than I do about what's best for my children. I never judged your decisions. You judged me constantly. Every time you offered to help with something, every time you suggested a different approach, every time you looked at me like I wasn't doing enough or wasn't doing it right. The accusation stung because there was a grain of truth in it. I had worried about some of her choices, had occasionally offered suggestions that probably came across as criticism. But that was normal grandmother behavior, not the systematic undermining she was describing. So you decided to solve that problem by cutting me out entirely. I decided to create some boundaries so I could figure out how to be a mother without constantly feeling like I was being evaluated. Boundaries, I repeated slowly. Is that what you call excluding me from Thanksgiving? Is that what you call not telling me about Tommy's soccer games or Emma's school play? Those weren't deliberate exclusions. Stop lying to me, Calla. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I was tired of the careful dance we'd been doing around the truth. Just stop. We both know exactly what you've been doing, and we both know why. She stared at me with something approaching hatred. Fine. You want the truth? Here's the truth. You're suffocating, Joelle. You hover and you worry and you make suggestions and you want to be involved in every decision. Michael used to complain about it all the time. The lie was so vicious and so obviously calculated to hurt me that I almost admired her audacity. Michael never complained about me to you. How would you know? You weren't there for most of our marriage. You were too busy taking care of David to pay attention to what your son actually needed. What my son needed was a wife who loved him for who he was, not someone who saw him as a meal ticket. The accusation hung between us like a challenge. Calla's face went white, then red, and for a moment I thought she might actually strike me. How dare you, she whispered. How dare I what? Tell the truth? Michael was worth $750,000 dead, Calla. How much was he worth to you alive? I loved him. You loved what he could provide. The house, the lifestyle, the security. But you didn't love him enough to share him with his mother, did you? You didn't love him enough to make room in your perfect little family for the woman who raised him. Calla stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking completely. You think you know everything, don't you? You think you're such a perfect mother, such a perfect grandmother. But you know what? Michael felt sorry for you. He stayed in touch with you out of obligation, not love. The words were designed to destroy me, and 18 months ago, they might have succeeded. But sitting there with the silver bracelet Marcus had given me still warm on my wrist, with the memory of his hand in mine still fresh, I realized that Cala's opinion of my relationship with my son no longer had the power to devastate me. Maybe he did, I said calmly. But obligation can be a form of love too, and at least he felt obligated to me. What does that say about how he felt about you? The question hit home in a way I hadn't expected. Cala's face crumpled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, I saw genuine vulnerability instead of calculated manipulation. He was going to leave me, she whispered. Before he got sick, he was going to leave me. He said he'd fallen out of love, that we'd grown apart, that he wanted to try counseling but he didn't think it would work. The admission stunned me into silence. I'd had no idea Michael's marriage was in trouble. In the last few months of his life, when the cancer treatments were overwhelming and everyone was focused on just getting through each day, family dynamics had seemed irrelevant compared to the larger battle we were fighting. The life insurance policy, she continued, her voice breaking. He increased it 3 months before he was diagnosed, not because he was planning to die, but because he was planning to divorce me. He wanted to make sure I'd be financially secure so I couldn't claim he was abandoning his children. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Michael's increased calls to Marcus, his questions about family medical history, his sudden interest in making sure everyone knew they were loved. He'd been preparing for a major life change when cancer derailed everything. So when he got sick, you had a choice to make, I said slowly. Be the devoted wife nursing her husband through his final illness, or be the woman he was planning to leave. I chose to love him, Cala said fiercely. I chose to be there for him, to take care of him, to make his last months as comfortable as possible. And I chose to make sure his children would remember him as a man who was loved and cherished, not as someone who was planning to abandon us. And you chose to make sure I wouldn't interfere with that narrative. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. You would have asked questions. You would have noticed things. You would have made it complicated. For the first time since this conversation began, I felt genuine sympathy for Cala. She'd been trapped in an impossible situation, trying to hold together a marriage that was already broken while dealing with a terminal diagnosis and 2 young children who needed stability. But sympathy didn't excuse the months of manipulation and exclusion that had followed. I understand why you did it, I said finally. But Michael has been gone for 18 months, Cala. At what point were you planning to stop punishing me for existing? I wasn't punishing you. You were. Because every time you looked at me, you were reminded that Michael might have chosen differently if he'd lived. You were reminded that there were people in his life who might have supported whatever decision he made, even if it meant the end of your marriage. Cala wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving mascara streaks across her cheeks. So what happens now? Now you file the paperwork for my portion of the insurance money. Now you stop lying to the children about why their grandmother isn't around. And now you figure out how to co-parent with me instead of trying to replace me. And if I don't? I thought about Marcus waiting for my call, about the $25,000 that was rightfully mine, about Tommy and Emma growing up without really knowing their father's mother. Then I stopped making this easy for you. I stopped pretending that your version of family is the only one that matters, and I stopped protecting you from the consequences of your choices. Cala stared at me for a long moment, seeming to weigh her options. Finally, she picked up her purse and headed toward the door. I'll think about what you said. Don't think too long, I called after her. I'm done waiting for you to decide whether I'm worth including in my grandchildren's lives. After she left, I sat in my quiet house and realized that something fundamental had shifted. For months, I'd been trying to earn my way back into Cala's good graces, accepting crumbs of contact with Tommy and Emma and telling myself it was better than nothing. but I wasn't that desperate anymore. I had choices now, and people who valued me, and resources I'd forgotten I possessed. When I called Marcus that evening, my voice was steady. "How did it go?" he asked. "It went exactly as badly as expected, but for the first time in months, I don't care." "Good," he said simply. "That means you're ready for whatever comes next." "What comes next?" "Whatever we want to come next." The freedom in that statement, the possibility it represented, made me smile for the first time all day. Tomorrow, I would start the paperwork to claim my inheritance. I would call a lawyer to understand my rights as a grandmother. And I would begin building a life that didn't revolve around appeasing someone who had never wanted me around in the first place. Tonight, I was going to plan a future with someone who actually wanted to be part of it. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of Marcus's house in Galena, watching the sunrise paint the Mississippi River gold through the large windows. We'd decided to sell both our properties and buy this place together, a restored Victorian with enough space for his daughter's family to visit and close enough to Cedar Rapids that I could maintain regular contact with Tommy and Emma when Calla allowed it. The transition hadn't been smooth. There had been lawyers involved, family meetings that felt more like negotiations, and several weeks when I wondered if the battle was worth the emotional cost. But this morning, as I sipped coffee and planned the day ahead, I knew I'd made the right choice. My phone buzzed with a text message from Linda. "How's retirement treating you, Mom? Scott and I are still planning to visit next month." I smiled as I typed back, "Retirement is wonderful. Marcus is teaching me to fish, and I'm teaching him to make your grandmother's apple pie. Can't wait to see you both." The dynamic between my children and Marcus had been fascinating to navigate. Linda had been cautiously supportive from the beginning, mainly because she could see how happy the relationship made me. Michael's children had been more complex. Tommy, now 9, had adapted quickly to having another grandfather figure, while 11-year-old Emma was still working through her loyalty to her father's memory. But progress was being made. Last weekend, Marcus had attended Emma's piano recital, and she'd actually smiled when he complimented her performance afterward. Small steps, but meaningful ones. "Good morning, beautiful." Marcus appeared in the doorway, already dressed for our morning walk along the river trail. At 71, he was in better shape than most men 20 years younger, a benefit of his active retirement and generally optimistic outlook on life. "Good morning yourself?" I kissed his cheek as he poured his own coffee. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years. I think it's the company." We'd been living together for 3 months now, and I was still adjusting to the comfort of sharing daily life with someone again. It was different from my marriage to David, less focused on practical partnership and more on genuine companionship. Marcus and I were both old enough to know who we were, secure enough to respect each other's independence, and wise enough to appreciate the gift of finding love twice in one lifetime. "Any word from Calla this week?" he asked, settling into the chair across from me. "She called yesterday to confirm the kids can come for the weekend. No drama, no last-minute changes. I think she's finally accepting the new normal." The new normal had taken months to establish. After our confrontation at Thanksgiving, Calla had initially tried to dig in harder, threatening to limit my access to the children even further if I insisted on claiming the insurance money. But when my lawyer pointed out that grandparents had legal rights in Iowa and that her financial manipulations might not look favorable in a custody proceeding, she'd backed down. The $25,000 had been processed within 2 weeks. I'd used part of it to establish college funds for Tommy and Emma, money that Calla couldn't access or control. The rest had gone toward legal fees and the down payment on this house. More importantly, we'd established a formal visitation schedule. Every other weekend, alternating holidays, and 2 weeks during the summer when the children could stay with Marcus and me. It wasn't the close, daily involvement I'd once imagined having with my grandchildren, but it was honest and sustainable. "She's probably realized that fighting you was more exhausting than just sharing custody," Marcus observed. He was right. Calla had discovered that I was no longer the easily manipulated widow she could dismiss with vague promises and scheduling conflicts. When she tried to cancel visits for frivolous reasons, I called my lawyer. When she attempted to badmouth me to the children, I calmly corrected the record during our time together. When she suggested that my relationship with Marcus was somehow inappropriate or harmful to the children's well-being, I simply reminded her that both Tommy and Emma seemed quite happy with their expanded family. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Marcus and I exchanged glances. We weren't expecting anyone this early. I opened the door to find Emma standing on the porch with a small overnight bag, her face streaked with tears. "Grandma Jo? Can I stay with you for a while?" Behind her, Kala's SUV was pulling away from the curb quickly, as if she couldn't wait to escape. "Of course, sweetheart." I pulled Emma into a hug, noting that she was still in her pajamas with a coat thrown over them. "What's wrong?" "Mom and I had a big fight. She said I could come here if I thought you were so much better at taking care of kids." I felt a familiar surge of anger at Kala's emotional manipulation, but I kept my voice calm. "Well, you're always welcome here. Let's get you some breakfast and you can tell me what happened." Over pancakes and hot chocolate, the story emerged. Emma had asked if she could invite a friend to her upcoming birthday party, and when Kala said no because the friend's family was not our kind of people, Emma had protested. The argument had escalated until Emma declared that she wanted to live with me because I wouldn't care about stupid things like how much money people had. She told me I was ungrateful and spoiled and that if I liked your house so much better, I should just move in permanently. Emma finished, fresh tears starting to fall. Marcus, who'd been quietly listening while making his own breakfast, sat down with us. That must have been very hurtful to hear. "She didn't mean it," Emma said quickly, displaying the complicated loyalty of a child caught between adults. "She was just mad." "Maybe," I said carefully. "But even when we're mad, we shouldn't say things that make the people we love feel bad. Like when I told Tommy he was stupid for crying when Dad died. Exactly like that. Do you remember how you felt after you said it?" "Terrible. I apologized like a million times." "That's because you love Tommy and you realized your words had hurt him. Sometimes adults need to apologize too." Emma considered this while chewing a bite of pancake. "Do you think Mom will apologize?" "I don't know, sweetheart, but I know that whatever happened between you and your mom doesn't change how much she loves you, or how much I love you." The conversation was interrupted by my phone ringing. Kala's name appeared on the screen, and Emma immediately tensed. "Should I answer it?" I asked Emma. She nodded reluctantly. "Hello, Kala. Is Emma okay?" Kala's voice was thick with tears and what sounded like genuine panic. "I didn't mean for her to just run off like that. I was going to drive her over myself after we both calmed down, but she was already out the door before I could stop her. She's fine. She's having breakfast. Can I talk to her?" I looked at Emma, who shook her head frantically. "She's not ready to talk right now. But she's safe, and she's welcome to stay as long as she needs to. Joelle, please. I know I handled this badly. I was stressed about work, and I took it out on her, and I said things I didn't mean." The admission was more honest than anything I'd heard from Kala in months. "Then maybe you should think about how to make it right. Can I come over, just to see her, to make sure she's okay?" I consulted Emma with my eyes. After a moment, she nodded. "You can come over, but no pressure for her to come home until she's ready." An hour later, Kala arrived looking genuinely contrite. She apologized to Emma without making excuses, acknowledged that her comment about our kind of people was wrong and hurtful, and promised to think more carefully before speaking when she was angry. "I don't want you to feel like you have to choose between your mom and me," I told Emma as Kala prepared to leave. "You love us both, and that's okay. Families can be complicated. Even when people get mad at each other? Especially then." Emma decided to go home with Kala that afternoon, but not before extracting a promise that she could still spend the upcoming weekend with Marcus and me as planned. As I watched them drive away together, I realized that something had fundamentally shifted in our family dynamic. For the first time since David's death, I felt like I had agency in my relationships with my grandchildren. I wasn't dependent on Kala's goodwill or subject to her arbitrary decisions about when and how I could be involved in their lives. Emma had known she could come to me when she needed refuge, and that knowledge had given her the strength to stand up for herself with her mother. You handled that well, Marcus said, putting his arm around me as we watched their car disappear. I'm learning that I have more power in these relationships than I thought I did. I just had to be willing to use it. And what have you learned about Kala? I considered the question. Over the past 6 months, I'd watched Kala slowly adjust to the reality that she couldn't control every aspect of her children's emotional lives. The process had been difficult for all of us, but it had also revealed something I hadn't expected. Underneath the manipulation and the desperate need for control was a young woman who was genuinely terrified of being abandoned. I've learned that hurt people sometimes hurt people, I said finally. And that forgiveness doesn't mean allowing yourself to be treated badly. Very wise. I had a good teacher. I smiled up at him. Plus, it's easier to be generous when you're not constantly afraid of losing everything. That evening, as Marcus and I sat on our porch watching the sunset over the river, my phone buzzed with a message from Emma. Thank you for letting me come over today. I love you, Grandma Joe. I showed the message to Marcus, and he squeezed my hand. No regrets? He asked. I thought about the question seriously. The past year had been tumultuous, filled with difficult conversations, painful realizations, and the kind of family drama I'd never imagined being part of. But it had also brought me Marcus, a deeper relationship with my grandchildren, and a sense of my own worth that I'd lost somewhere along the way. None, I said firmly. Not a single one. As if to punctuate the moment, another message came through, this time from Tommy. Mom says we can come fishing with Marcus next weekend. Can he teach me to catch a really big one? I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in years. I think that can be arranged. The future stretched ahead of us, uncertain, but full of possibilities. There would be more family negotiations, more growing pains as everyone adjusted to our blended relationships, more moments when I'd have to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for myself. But for the first time since David's death, I felt equipped to handle whatever came next. I had love, I had resources, and most importantly, I had the knowledge that I was worth fighting for. The little girl who'd once been excluded from Thanksgiving dinner seemed like a stranger now. In her place was a woman who knew her own value, who insisted on being treated with respect, and who'd built a life that reflected her actual worth rather than other people's convenience. Marcus pulled me closer as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. What are you thinking about? He asked. Just wondering what David would think of all this. I think he'd be proud of you. And I think he'd approve of us. I believed that was true. David had been a generous man who'd wanted nothing more than for me to be happy. He wouldn't have wanted me to spend the rest of my life alone, grieving for him and accepting whatever scraps of affection other people were willing to offer. I love you, I told Marcus, the words still feeling new and precious despite months of practice. I love you too. Thank you for giving us a second chance. Thank you for being worth the wait. As we sat together in comfortable silence, I realized that the story that had begun with rejection and exclusion had somehow transformed into something beautiful. Not despite the pain I'd endured, but because of how I'd chosen to respond to it. I'd stopped waiting for other people to decide my worth. I'd stopped accepting crumbs when I deserved a seat at the table. And in doing so, I'd discovered that the best revenge against those who'd tried to diminish me was simply living a life that reflected my true value. The silver bracelet Marcus had given me that first day in Galena caught the porch light, and I smiled. Some gifts, I thought, are worth waiting 46 years to receive. And some stories have endings that are really just new beginnings in disguise. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.